Our next guest is a former vice chair of the CRTC, a former publisher of the Calgary Herald. He is a widely sought out commentator on the media industry and the media landscape in Canada. He's also a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, where he's written an interesting new report looking at the media landscape, the cultural landscape in Canada, a new vision for Canada. It's called Rethinking Arts and Media Funding. You can read more at macdonaldlaurier.ca. One and only Peter Menzies is with us here today. Peter, so great to have you back with us.
Always a pleasure, Rob. Thanks for asking.
It's funny, we seem to be having a conversation almost constantly, but like piecemeal, right? In pieces about Canadian culture, the extent to which we need to protect Canadian culture. It's funny, as you point out in the piece, I mean, it's been 75 years now since we've had a real deep dive, big picture look at all of this.
Yeah, I think, I was having a conversation earlier with somebody else, and one of the themes that's gone through the last decade or so, maybe a little bit longer, but it's more apparent in the last 10, 11 years, is how Canada is struggling to understand what's happened with the digital age, right? That how fundamentally the World Wide Web and the internet has changed society and the whole tech wave. So all of our institutions, like the CRTC, et cetera, are still stuck in the 20th century, in that sense. And this is a very different world, right? From the Massey Commission, which you noted, which is the sort of genesis of the Canadian cultural framework, government cultural framework. I should be clear on that because there is culture beyond government. It goes back for a very long time, and it's been added on to. It's kind of like a house that you're constantly renovating and putting additions on and that sort of stuff. And this paper sort of says, it's probably time for a whole new house. That doesn't mean tearing things down. It means building something new that's a better fit for the 21st century, and that helps us maintain our culture and not be overwhelmed by cheap American product.
Right. So would that be a commission? Like, do we need another Massey Commission, something similar to it?
I think that's probably the only tool we have at the moment. I mean, you don't need to create an entirely new Royal Commission. People haven't, used Royal Commissions for quite some time, but you could do some sort of very broad-based consultation. And the tricky part with that is, of course, is that you're going to get people who do very well by the status quo, who will show up and they will be afraid of change and they won't want change. And I think that you need some real leadership from government and other cultural leaders to get around that and say, hey, look, we need to talk about some of these things. I mean, one example, I know it's controversial, and I should say from the outset that we do need to protect the French language in Canada in terms of that, but the funding formula for most of these is 2/3 English, 1/3 French. That goes back to a time when about 1/3 of Canadians spoke French in the home. It's now 20%. Now, Trudeau suggested that we should change the funding so it was 40% French, not just 33% French. But we need to talk about that because, I mean, how fair is that, right? Is that fair? Is it appropriate? There are all kinds of third languages, unofficial languages now going around too. Do we fund that or not? I mean, we need to be able to have grown-up discussions about these sorts of things.
In terms of like the aim or the objective of all of these regulations and funds and agencies, so much of which was born from the Massey Commission, do we have a clear sense of what those aims and objectives and purposes are, or do we need to even rethink what they should be or what success of all of these endeavors looks like?
Well, I think we need to. I think the aims, as they're stated, are generally fine. That we want to be able to promote. We want Canadians to understand Canada. We want Canadians to know Canada's story, Canada's histories. We want them to be able to see that in film and television and other popular media. We want people to understand that in this country we have crown attorneys. We have a court of king's bench. We don't have district attorneys, right? We don't have. You cannot plead the fifth in Canada. You hear people use these phrases all the time these days, and it's because they watch too much American television and there's no Canadian television going on with that. And that is, I think it sounds, it sounds simplistic, but it's a pretty good example of how you lose your culture. You start saying y'all in your tweets and stuff like that, and these Americanisms. But I think the big thing is that we need to focus on the outcomes, not just the aspirations. And the aspirations are that's easy to say, but we have a system that I think it measures its success basically on how much money it gathers and how much it redistributes, and how many members of the Writers Guild had jobs last year, and how many members of ACTRA and that sort of stuff, when it should be measured on how many Canadians engaged with. I'm not saying those things are bad, but the measure needs to be, are Canadians becoming more familiar with their country and its history? And are they, more knowledgeable? Are they more prideful? Are they ashamed? And I don't care whatever it is, but do they have thoughts on it other than, I'd say a very widespread view these days is CanCon sucks. I want to watch,
Yeah.
I want to watch U.S. college football. Let me do it. Let me go Notre Dame and all that sort of stuff. Like those are real depreciations of Canadian culture, in my view.
Well, yeah, I do think that maybe Canadians feel a disconnect with what's being served up as Canadian content, and I think the idea of learning our history, taking pride in our history, pride in our country. I don't know. I mean, has that become kind of unfashionable in the culture industry?
Yeah, well, it might have been, right? Like, I mean, you know, you look at a lot of the funding mechanisms, like inside the Canada Media Fund, and now it's hived off so that there's a number of funds for special interest groups, and there's we need more programming for the LGBTQS plus community. We need more for Indigenous. We need more for racialized, for BIPOC, for Black Canadians, and that sort of stuff. All of those things, those are sound aspirations. You want everybody to feel part of society, but there's no need to be ghettoizing those items into those. What you're doing is you're creating niches, and when you start
Yeah.
creating niches, you just fragment the viewer base. So, sort of if you're gay, you're supposed to go and watch the LGBTQ stuff. I'm not sure that even most gay people are, you know, unaware of the fact that no, I just like to watch a good TV program or a good movie, sort of thing. So I think we need to talk about that sort of stuff because it just becomes fragmented in its ways for people who are employed in those sectors to have work and have funding, but I'm not sure it gives us the outcomes we're looking for.
In terms of how the news media fits in, right? This used to be about making sure we heard Canadian songs on the radio, or there were Canadian sitcoms to watch, or Canadian movies to watch. Maybe it was taken for granted that we would always just go back to the Canadian newspaper or the Canadian, the 6 o'clock news. Now that the news media, journalism itself has kind of become threatened through a variety of circumstances, has it become a part of this mix then?
Yeah, it very much is. I mean, we right now we're providing a lot of subsidies for newspapers, as we still call them, even though they're primarily online entities.
Right.
Which I think is an example of a sort of 19th and 20th century institution that still hasn't adapted to the 21st century. And what we're doing is we're subsidizing business models that no longer work. Um, that doesn't mean that news shouldn't be produced and distributed or that journalism doesn't have value, but it does maybe mean that the horse that it rode for a while is just an old nag now, and we kind of need a fresh horse. So we need to work on how do we create new vehicles? How do we connect? I mean, podcasts are one. Like there were no podcasts. Maybe there were 10 years ago, but there certainly
Right.
weren't 20 years ago. And to me, that's really replaced so much of what you used to do, right? News talk radio, right? There's still a fair bit of news talk radio, but it's not like it used to be.
No.
And there's so much fragmentation in terms of that. I was looking at some stats the other day. I mean, the radio business just keeps getting smaller and smaller. It will survive as long as people are driving to and from work, I think. But more and more people, I think, as they get more and more modern vehicles, are just listening to podcasts as they sit in traffic. And so, what do? Do we subsidize the old models, radio, which the CRTC is doing, or do we try to clear the track for podcasts? right? So do we subsidize the past, or do we encourage the innovation for the future we need for the future?
Right. Well, it's almost like we're trying to impose the past on the present and the
Yes.
future. The past where there were only so many
Yeah,
spots
for
on the
sure.
TV dial or the radio dial,
Yeah.
where it was easier to impose regulations. The digital world's a whole different beast, isn't it?
Oh, for sure. I mean, the broadcasting world was spectrum is a limited resource, right? So you could, there is a reason for the government to be involved and that sort of
Sure.
stuff
Yeah.
because it was a public asset and it's a limited resource, so it needs to be managed, et cetera, et cetera. But the online world is entirely different. But so much of what we've been trying to do with the Online Streaming Act, Online News Act, and that sort of stuff is take the 21st century and stuff it into these structures that were built for the 20th century.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm trying to get at in that paper too, where it comes to arts and culture and that sort of stuff. Like we need to, it's actually really important right now. I think it should be a good time for Canadians to think now that, that Donald Trump has been saying you could be the 51st state. He stopped calling our prime minister a governor
That's
for
true.
the
Yeah.
time being, but you would think Canadians would say, okay, what can we do? Like what,
Mhm.
why do our domestic sports leagues have to actually pay our broadcasters um, to get on TV, and why do they prefer to just buy cheap? I can watch any number of U.S. women's college basketball games
Yeah.
on Sportsnet and TSN, for instance, but I don't know if they have ever shown a Canadian women's college basketball game. Right? There's something really wrong with that, like at
Mhm.
its core. And the reason is that they don't want to spend any money producing the Canadian product when they can buy the American product for basically pennies on the dollar and just fill their subscription, fill their programming with it. That's wrong. It happens. There's similar things happen all across the board. And as long as that's allowed to continue, we're just going to be kind of a cultural annex of the U.S.
Right.
And at least Puerto
Uh,
Rico has its own language. But, well, I
that's
guess we do
true.
too,
Yeah.
French. But yeah,
You do talk about in your piece two pretty big and important institutions in all of this, which we've alluded to here already, the CRTC and the CBC. And I think still they both have relevance, they both have a role to play, but you talk about really rethinking and overhauling both of their mandates.
yeah. The CBC is interesting because if it's going to serve, the prime minister's talked about how he'd like to have its funding levels the same as they have in Britain and Germany and
Yeah,
other
right.
public, but it's still kind of a quasi commercial outfit to it. It's a two-headed monster in terms of that. But there's a real opportunity there for it to actually play the role of a public broadcaster. Like I mentioned, sports, and you don't see Canadian college sports, or you don't even see things like the new women's soccer league or the new women's hockey league, or the Canadian Premier Soccer League or the Elite Basketball League. They had their championships last week. The CBC should be able to be showing all that stuff,
Yeah.
right? It should be that if it has a role to play, at least give those folks a chance to establish their audiences, give them the exposure they need to grow, rather than sort of competing with TSN and Sportsnet, which are largely American content. That should be at the core of the CBC. So if you're going to fund it, at least make it useful, right? Like
Yeah.
to their credit, they show a great deal of Canadian content, but they shouldn't be out there, behaving like a commercial company and charging some of these folks to basically do what we're already paying the CBC to do.
Right. So it's more about filling a void as opposed to competing with or undermining private industry.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
that's kind of what it was formed for in the very first place. The CBC was to make sure that people, even in the 1920s, 1930s, NBC opened a station in Toronto, right? People were concerned that American content was, which is pretty popular, and they do make a lot of great stuff. I mean, they're the world's entertainment and information leader in terms of that. So it's tough. It's tough to compete with. But so you create institutions like that to make sure that there's something purely Canadian that you can go to. And if the CBC wants to be loved again, it could probably get back to its roots and start really, really promoting the country, not just promoting, as many people see it, just sort of the politics of one side of the country.
As for the CRTC, I mean, it seemed like folly, maybe, that the idea that the CRTC could somehow regulate, Spotify and YouTube and all of these digital entities. What role does the CRTC still have moving forward, do you think?
I actually think it's probably time that we kind of grandfathered the CRTC. I've thought this for some time. I think that we need to have an entirely new approach to how we regulate communications. I mean, I said some of the aspirations are fine, but watching the CRTC struggle with the Online Streaming Act, right? Trying to bring companies inside the system when the Broadcasting Act says in order to be inside the system, you have to be Canadian owned and controlled, and none of these companies are Canadian owned and controlled, just illustrates how mixed up it gets. We should have a brand new Canadian Communications Commission, which at its heart is designed around regulatory issues regarding the internet. Like uh, uh, free, how not interfering with the free flow of content. I mean, censorship is required and certainly at some levels, and people are going to demand it for things like porn and that sort of stuff. But we have to understand that the heart of the communication system now is the digital world. It's not over-the-air broadcasting, and it's not cable. This is the future, and we need to go with it from there, and start building things that promote rather than protect. We tried to build walls around Canada for years and years and years. You could kind of do that when resources were limited. In an online world, you can't do that, man. Like,
Yeah.
but there's such a great opportunity for Canadian content because you can that wall works both ways. You can send your stuff out. There's a huge market right next door in the States, the English speaking world, the Francophone world for French comment. We got to get away from this protectionist idea and start being proud of ourselves and promoting ourselves.
In the meantime, though, it just feels like we're kind of stumbling from one policy to the other, and Canadians are voting with their feet, or their eyes or ears, as it were. So I don't know. I mean, where do you see us going if we don't, take a step back and review all of this?
I think it's going to be really. Well, if the Online Streaming Act becomes a victim of our negotiations with the states, like I think it will.
Yeah.
Then we're going to be just kind of hung out to dry because we put all our eggs in that basket, and it halted. And the same with the Online News Act. Like, a lot of innovation has stopped. A lot of room for new products has been taken away because we're subsidizing what your friend of mine, Jen Gerson, calls zombie newspapers, right? That really are, to all intents and purposes, are dead, but are still staggering around, soaking up resources and that sort of stuff. If we don't, if those things fall apart, then we're suddenly left without ideas going forward, because our ideas for the last few years have been just to subsidize what doesn't work. And we gave up on searching for what does work. And so we're very far behind, and there are lots of smart people out there who the government needs to get together and say, okay, what does the future look like? What can we do about the future? And can we make some radical changes? But so far, we've seen no indication from the Carney government that it has any interest in cultural policy or digital policy, except for AI. That seems to be a focus for them.
Well, the paper is up. It's online at Macdonald-Laurier.ca, a new vision for Canada, rethinking arts and media funding. Peter Menzies, appreciate the insights. As always, thank you so much for joining us here.